Today we're going to be reading a paper I found on JSTOR called The Very Place of Apparition by Pietro Terzi. This is from the journal Research and Phenomenology, and it was published in June of 2018. You know, it's been a while since I've done a webcam video like this, so we're just going to get started here. The Very Place of Apparition, Derrida on Husserl's concept of noema. Abstract. In Spectres of Marx, Derrida suggests that the most fundamental condition of phenomenality lies in the ambiguous state of the noema, defined as an intentional and non-real component of irrelevance, neither in the world nor in consciousness. This irreality of the noematic correlate is conceived by Derrida as the origin of sense and experience. Already in his Of Grammatology, Derrida maintained that the difference between the appearing and the appearance, between the world and the lived experience, is the condition of all other differences. Unfortunately, Derrida limits himself to a few self-evident remarks without further elaborating. The aim of this paper is twofold. On the one hand, to contextualize Derrida's interpretation of the noema from a theoretical and historical perspective. On the other hand, to show its effects on the early moments of Derrida's philosophy. The result will shed light on a neglected issue in the relationship between deconstruction and phenomenology. Introduction. The relationship between Derrida and the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl has been at the center of a great deal of excellent scholarship over the last decades. The historical background of this confrontation is now clearly defined, as well as its main theoretical stakes. In this paper, I would like to focus on a specific aspect of the Derridian reading of phenomenology that has been quite overlooked by scholars, namely the question of the appearing as such, of the transcendental conditions of phenomenality that Derrida briefly addresses only a few times in his oeuvre. This issue is strictly connected to his interpretation of the Husserlian concept of noema, which, as I will try to demonstrate, seems to have had some sway on the development of Derrida's own philosophy. In fact, as Leonard Lauer has pointed out in a classic study, the Derridian description of the noema is the concept of difference reconstructed entirely in Husserlian terms. This bold statement deserves to be accounted for in a more detailed fashion. Now, the nature of a peculiar concept such as the noema has been widely debated among scholars, mainly due to the often ambiguous and lexically heterogeneous characterizations that Husserl himself provided in his oeuvre, in Ideas 1 and the Cartesian Meditations in particular. As to the Cartesian Meditations, Husserl deals with the noema mainly in the second and in the fifth meditation. See Cartesian Meditations in Introduction to Phenomenology. As is well known, in the 20th century, two major schools faced each other over this issue, albeit many other perspectives could be surveyed. Footnote. Given that Husserl characterized an act's noema as both sense and the object as intended, D.W. Smith has enumerated four prominent interpretations of it, namely the intentional model object in Garden, the neo-phenomenalist model, Gurwitch, the mediating sense model, Folesdal, McIntyre, and Smith, Dreyfus, Mohanty, and the bracketed object model, Sokolowski. For a brief but clear account of the debate around the status of the noema, see the introduction to John Day Drummond and Lester Ambrier, The Phenomenology of the Noema. See also the essays collected in the section titled The Theory of Noema of Rudolf Bernet, Don Welton and Gina Zavada, Edmund Husserl, Critical Assessments of Leading Philosophers, Volume 4, The Web of Meaning, Language, Noema, Subjectivity, and Intersubjectivity. On the one hand, there was Aaron Gurwitch, Gurtish, who in 1940 understood the noema as what we perceive in an intentional act, the object itself being simply the collection of the noemata of different acts directed towards it. That's an interesting use of act and acts. The plural seems to take the place of the singular and vice versa. Okay, a lot of these footnotes are just references. On the other hand, in opposition to Gurwitch and inspired by a 1969 paper by Dagfinn Folesdal, Ronald McIntyre and David Woodruff Smith distinguished the noema from the intended object and identified it as the intentional content, a mediating and unifying element analogous to the Frasian sin. As it has been noted, the main tenets of both interpretations present some defects that are typical of a non-historical reading of Husserl, which means that the interpreters overlooked the genetic and diachronic evolution of the concept of noema in Husserl's philosophy. We can anticipate that the same bias affects also Derrida's interpretation, which shares a static and systematic view of phenomenology. I will proceed as follows. 1. First, I will analyze the main places where Derrida takes up the problem of phenomenality in relation to the notion of noema. 2. Then I will deploy and develop the question through a systematic reference to Husserlian texts in order to reconstruct the conceptual background of Derrida's remarks. 3. Finally, I will show some consequences of Derrida's interpretation of the noema on his early philosophy. Section 2. Noema and Phenomenality in Derrida's works. The point of departure is a note from Derrida's Spectres of Marx, a text that was first delivered as a conference at the University of California, Riverside in 1993 and then published towards the end of the same year. Throughout the book, Derrida plays on the semantic of the spectre, le revenant, developing a complex and at times confused phenomenology of the visible as such and its conditions of possibility. According to him, the notion of the spectre, which is formulated through a reading of William Shakespeare's Hamlet, implies a paradoxical form of phenomenality. Unlike the spirit, the spectre is disembodied, fleshless, and it does not belong to material reality. Nevertheless, it preserves some semblance of form, the tangible intangibility of a proper body without flesh, but still the body of someone is someone other. Therefore, the spectre is located between the real and the unreal, the actual and the non-actual. Spectrality, in fact, questions the very border between the present, the actual or present reality of the present, and everything that can be opposed to it. Absence, non-presence, non-effectivity, inactuality, virtuality, and so forth. The political concerns and the literary expressions that frame these observations should not blind us to their theoretical background. My claim is that they could provide some insights into Derrida's conception of experience and appearing as such, which stems directly from his early phenomenological formation. It is no coincidence that in a footnote to the 5th chapter, Derrida refers explicitly to phenomenology, and I guess here we, make a point to read a footnote from another work. The radical possibility of all spectrality should be sought in the direction that Husserl identifies as an intentional but non-real component of the phenomenological lived experience, namely the noema. This non-reality, this intentional but non-real inclusion of the noematic correlate is neither in the world nor in consciousness, but it is precisely the condition of any experience, any objectivity, any phenomenality, namely of any noetico-noematic correlation, whether originary or modified. It is no longer regional. Without the non-real inclusion of this intentional component, one could not speak of any manifestation of any phenomenality in general, that being for a consciousness, that appearing appearance, apparitzer, appartissant. I butchered that pronunciation there. I figured it warranted mentioning, though. Which is neither consciousness nor the being that appears to it. It is not such an irreality, its independence both in relation to the world. Is it not such an irreality, its independence both in relation to the world and in relation to the real stuff of ecological subjectivity, the very place of apparition? In the quoted passage, Derrida repeats the same gesture he already accomplished in his 1968 text, Ends of Man. He determines phenomenology in general, even in its Hegelian sense, as a thought of the Phanestat. Is that what that says? Phanestai. So almost like a weird spelling of fantasy, I'm tempted to think. Of the manifestation of being to man, in accordance to a telos that entails a perfect correspondence between the subject and the world, of the subject and the world, and between the subject and its own conceptions. Surely this account of Husserlian phenomenology is quite simplifying, for it relies on Derrida's general notion of metaphysics as the privilege of the present. In the third book of the Ideas, which was not available in the late 1940s to early 1950s, the period of Derrida's formation in phenomenology, Husserl defines his own philosophical science as an exploration of ideal possibilities of lived process, Erlebnis. Therefore, phenomenology is not merely a description of essences or states of consciousness, of things and perceptual modalizations. This would be the task of a descriptive psychology, but an inquiry on the transcendental conditions of appearing, on the connections between essences, and on the essential laws that regulate the field of Erlebnis. This is what Eugen Fink meant when, in the article of 1933 in the Kant Studien that received the approval of Edmund Husserl himself, he famously defined phenomenology as an investigation on the origin of the world. Husserl introduces and outlines this general aim in the first volume of the Ideas, the one that Derrida, for reasons that are both historical and theoretical, relies on while defining and deconstructing the main coordinates of phenomenology. And I will read this footnote here. Of course, Derrida and his generation were aware, unlike the first readers of Husserl, that the phenomenological enterprise did not stop at the first volume of the Ideas. The second one was published in 1952 after a lengthy gestation, gestation in which Husserl's pupils Edith Stein and Ludwig Landgrebe were involved. In the bibliography of his memoir, The Problem of Genesis in Husserl's Philosophy, defended 2 years later in 1954, Derrida included only the first volume of the Ideas in the classic translation of Paul Ricoeur based on the third German edition of 1928, identical to that of 1913, which he carefully read in the summer of 1952. In the bibliography, we find also an article by Ricoeur titled Analyses dans Ideen 2, published on the review Phenomenologie Existence in 1953. However, although Derrida knew the philological problems of the case, and despite a certain knowledge of the manuscripts of groups C and D, his approach to phenomenology was framed by the privilege of the first period of Husserl's work. This privilege is reflected on the ideas that the logical investigations in Irregular Ideas 1 contained the unchanging core of the entire Husserlian philosophy. See Jacques Derrida, Voice and Phenomenon, Introduction to the Problems of Signs in Husserl's Phenomenology. This assumption was most likely due to the filter of Ricoeur himself. The latter, in fact, believed Ideas 2, which he had been able to consult at the Husserl archives, to be nothing but the mise en oeuvre of a method presented in Ideas 1 in its basic form. Paul Ricoeur, Écrit to Husserl's Ideas 1. And we continue on here. In order to understand the passing remark of 1991 on the noetic-noematic correlation, it is necessary to return to Derrida's early works, where the references to Husserl are more systematic and careful than in later ones. In the footnote, Derrida specifically mentions the noema with its irreality as the very place of apparition, even as the condition of any experience, any objectivity, any phenomenality. It is a strong thesis, expressed in Derrida's usual orotund and hasty style, which could easily be dismissed as an exaggeration deprived of the proper argumentative backing. However, it is not the first time that this contention appears in Derrida's oeuvre. We can find its first occurrence in an early text that he wrote in 1959, Genesis and Structure and Phenomenology. There, in a few pages, Derrida raises sensitive genetic issues concerning the first book of Husserl's Ideas, and, by extension, the transcendental edifice in general. The most important aporia that Derrida detects is the one connected to the double correlation noesis noema and morphe hyle. This double correlation composes the all-inclusive phenomenological structure of which intentionality is the name, a structure that, according to Derrida, amounts to the origin of sense and allows for the opening to the light of phenomenality. In other words, intentionality is for Derrida a structure grounded on four interrelated poles: hyle, noesis, morphe, noema. Albeit noesis and morphe can be considered to be the same thing. For example, Costa describes intentionality as constituted of three moments: hyle, morphe, or noesis, noema, the objectual sense. That was 19. Okay. Yeah, on four interrelated poles, hyle, noesis, morphe, noema, which nonetheless present some crucial differences and whose nature is, according to him, not always clear in Husserl's analysis. In particular, Derrida submits that it is the status of the noema, an intentional but non-real, unreal component of experience, and the hyle, real but non-intentional, that poses the most menacing threats to the structure of intentionality and, intentionality being the main theme of phenomenology, to the foundation of transcendental phenomenology itself. In the discussion that followed the 1959 presentation, Derrida was asked by R.P. Breton for some clarification regarding the question of the noema. Derrida agreed that it was a difficult and decisive point and went on to explain why. Without the noema, i.e. the sense of an appearance, a pariter, that is not in consciousness nor in the transcendent and natural reality, there would be no objectivity, no intentionality, and no knowledge. Then he formulated the very conclusion that we find in Spectres of Marx about 30 years later. It is because there is something that has no region, a regional, that transcendental objectivity is possible, that the appearance, a pariter, of being is possible. 3. Gurwich's influence on Derrida. We have seen how Derrida maintains that, compared to the three others terms, the noema has a distinctive feature. It is neither in the world nor in consciousness. In this sense, the resemblance of Derrida's interpretation of the noema to the one developed by Gurwitch, sorry guys, I keep mispronouncing that, Gurwitch, is striking. In fact, it is reasonable to assume that the work of Gurwitch exerted some influence on Derrida, who mentions him at least twice in his early works. First, he includes his article on the intentionality of consciousness in the bibliography of his 1954 memoir, The Problem of Genesis in Husserl's Philosophy. Then, in Genesis and Structure and Phenomenology, he refers to Gurwich's The Field of Consciousness that appeared in French in 1957 with the title Théorie du champ de la conscience. The question of the noema is not at issue in Derrida's reference to Gurwitch. Nonetheless, he must have been familiar with his interpretation, which is developed in both the article and the book. In the article, Gurwitch observes clearly that the noema is to be distinguished from the real object, and at the same time from the act in the sense that it does not constitute a part, an element, a factor of the act, and does not really exist within consciousness, as the act does. He then concludes by saying that the noema, as distinct from the real object as well as from the act, turns out to be an irreal or ideal entity which belongs to the same sphere as meanings or significations. This is the sphere of sense, sin, which was, who did they say Sin's idea was? Ricoeur, I think. Either way, Derrida adds another twist to this characterization by relating the noema not only to the sphere of sense, i.e. how things appear, but also to phenomenality in general, i.e. the appearing of phenomena as such. This non-real and non-worldly character of the noema, which does not belong to consciousness in a real way, deserves a closer look. The following remarks are not meant to determine what the correct definition of Husserl's noema is, still very much the subject of active debate, but rather to provide a general account that could enable the understanding of Derrida's interpretation. 4. The noema in Husserl's ideas. Now, what is, or rather in which dimension dwells the noema? Husserl introduces this notion defined as a component or phase of experience in section 88 of Ideas 1. And as we can see from section 96, he was well aware of its problematic status. On approaching more closely, we become sensible of the great difficulties involved. They concern our understanding of the mode of being of the noema, the way in which it is implicit in the mental process. Implicit in the mental process, in which it is intended to in the mental process. Quite particularly, they concern the clean separation of those things which, as its really inherent components, belong to the mental process itself, and those which belong to the noema, which must be assigned to the noema as its own components. The noema defies any simple opposition between the thing per se and its mere psychic manifestation. As Derrida says, it is not the determined thing itself in its untamed existence, i.e., it is not the thing as such in its materiality. At the same time, however, it is not even a properly subjective moment, a really subjective moment, since it is indubitably given as an object for consciousness. The last claim is backed by what Husserl himself writes in the pages of Ideas 1 dedicated to the noetic-noematic correlation. There he argues that every intentional lived experience is noetic, as it is of essence to include a, more or less, layered act that directs itself towards the object in accordance with a certain character. To look, to judge, to link, to believe, to evaluate. These are all tokens of noetic moments of experience, of sense bestowals, sinjebungen. Beside the actual noematic components, there are also non-actual or non-inherent components that pertain to their correlates. The noema expresses, so to speak, these non-real components. It is the same in a very extended signification, which is immanent to every... It is the sense in a very extended signification, which is immanent to every lived experience. In the case of perception, for example, the noema, which would be perceived as perceived. Of course, it does not correspond to the thing simplicité that we find in the naturalistic attitude. Noesis and noema are in fact the fundamental structure of the Erlebnis that we attain after the eidetic reduction to the transcendental sphere, when a radical change, a change in sign, occurs. Those who detected in these Husserlian pages an excess of idealism used to make a case of the example of the tree, which could burn as a material thing but not as a noematic sense, an eidos. This is not about separating two objects, the real and the mental one. The difference lies not in the object, which remains the same, subsisting out of ourselves, but in our attitude towards it. As a matter of fact, shortly afterwards, Husserl clarifies that as soon as attentional modifications occur in the relation with the object, the concrete noemata modify themselves while retaining their noematic sense. The noema, therefore, varies as noetic modifications take place in our attitude towards the same objectivity. Footnote. However, we must always bear in mind what Husserl says in the section 98, i.e. that the, let me see here, sorry. Oh, parallelism between the unity of the object noematically meant in such and such a way, the unity of the object in the sense, and the constituting formations of consciousness, ordo e connexion rerum, ordo e connexion adierum, must not be confused with the parallelism between noesis and noema. Understood more particularly as the parallelism of noetic and corresponding noematic characteristics. Where were we? Oh, okay. The noema therefore varies as noetic modifications take place in our attitude towards the same objectivity. In this sense, Derrida is right when he concludes that ultimately the noema is neither of the world nor of consciousness, but it is the world or something of the world for consciousness. Taking the example of the tree, Husserl himself maintains that its noema is no more contained inherently than is the tree which belongs to actuality. And this perspective holds even when the analysis of the noetico-noematic correlations touches the highest spheres of consciousness, where the intentional stratification gets more complex, section 93 and onwards. Here we find, for example, the distinction between the object as such, e.g. the object we may estimate of a certain value and the object value, which are not again two different objects, but the same object plus a certain quality value. This object value, put in the quotation marks or square quotes, Anführungsscheichen of the epoche, or more precisely the quality of value, its being valuable, is what is included in the noema. Now these conceptual subtleties, only briefly sketched out, allow us to understand the dramatic difficulty that Husserl faced in specifying the status of the noema to get rid of every possible misconception. The distinction between noesis and noema is in fact crucial for the foundation of phenomenology itself. But what is, then, the true stake of Husserl's concept of noema? In approximate terms, we can say that it is the problem of sense. Here, sense does not correspond to an ideal meaning, but rather to the mode of givenness of an object, the sense that emerges from the synthesis of sensation data, or the identity syntheses that are achieved in acts of perception. Or, to use Husserl's words, the how of its modes of givenness. That was 37. Okay, so in approximate terms, we can say that it is the problem of sense, the sense that is in the objects without being dinglich, in the noema not as a concrete essence, but as an abstract form. This is the reason why Derrida can talk about an anarchy of the noema that cannot be resolved or normalized by attaching the noema to a certain region, be it that of consciousness or that of things. Footnote: one could establish a parallel between the anarchy of Derrida and the impassibility and the neutrality that Gilles Deleuze attributes to the sense in the third, the fifth, the 14th, and the 15th series of the Logic of Sense, where the confrontation with Husserl and the very concept of noema occupies a central role. See Gilles Deleuze, The Logic of Sense. There, for example, Deleuze argues that the noema is presented by Husserl as an impassive and incorporeal entity, without physical or mental existence, neither acting nor being acted upon, a pure result or pure appearance. Furthermore, in the 30th series, Deleuze defines the phantasm as a noematic attribute that distinguishes itself both from the state of affairs and the psychological lives. On the Deleuzian reading of Husserl and the Logic of Sense and Difference and Repetition, see so-and-so. As de Warren has poignantly remarked, the liminal status of the noema is not to be understood as a medium or intermediary representation or a semantic entity between consciousness and its object, a view that Husserl explicitly rejects. The noema does not have an origin in the different regions of being, nor can its sense be captured through traditional oppositions such as real, ideal, actual, possible, and individual generality. However, one has to be careful. The term anarchy does not mean independency. On the contrary, Husserl qualifies several times the noema as non-independent, for it does not exist out of our consciousness and neither without an objectual reference. This explains why, according to Derrida, the transcendental reduction, as a reduction to the regionality of consciousness, falls short of determining the status of the noema, which is in consciousness as well as in the thing. Of course, the noema could be attained only after the reduction and reflection, but the paradox lies in the fact that what we discover after the epoche is that sense permeates every actual lived experience, and so Derrida could say that the irregionality of the noema is the opening to the as such of being. And here we could depart from Derrida by saying that this opening is precisely the meaning of the épêché, that he misconceives the reduction as a sort of sacrifice of the world, a withdrawal from it, or even a sort of Cartesian doubt, and not as the very possibility of re-establishing its overall meaningfulness. Be that as it may, the essential point is that the concept of noema is there to signify that there is no experience without there being a sense, that the appearing as such occurs within the sense, i.e., according to a certain mode of givenness. In Derrida, its anarchic status, related to a transcendent consciousness, and, as Paul Ricoeur remarks in his commentary on the fourth section of Ideas 1, to a transcendent object, seems to be that of experience itself, whose sense is to be sought neither in the states of consciousness nor in the states of things alone. That is why in 1991 Derrida could say, as we have seen, that the noema is, due to its very irreality, the very place of apparition, the condition of any experience. Furthermore, Derrida adds that the noema is also the condition of every objectivity. How are we to understand this statement? The answer could lie in Husserl's assertion that noematic objects are unities transcendent to, but evidently intended in the mental processes, or Leibniz. The fact that they are not limited to the immanence of lived experience enables the process of idealization. For in lived experience we grasp an aspect of the objectivity that is not strictly real, nicht real, i.e. that does not have something to do with the domain of sensible materiality. The noematic object of perception, as intentional core and transcendental clue, can subsequently become a noematic object of different acts, recollection, desire, judgment, etc., which means that it can represent its essential features in different noemata, of memory, desire, judgment, etc. Husserl also adds that we cannot conceive of any object without at the same time conceiving of a multiplicity of intentional lived experiences, a synthesis of these moments. Furthermore, the noema, or more precisely the noesis noema structure, does not exist only in relation to a perception, but it is also part of more layered lived experiences, such as desiring or wanting, where there are no physical objectivities concerned. The noema of a perception, for example, is inherent to perception itself, as its sense. Nevertheless, it can be inherent also to a superior act, quote-unquote, superior act, for instance, judgment, which means that it can participate to its foundation, it can form its basis. Derrida would say that there is no sense without the possibility of its repetition. In his commentary on Husserl's Origin of Geometry, he writes that the non-reality of the noema may be what, in the last analysis, permits the repetition of sense as the same and makes the idealization of identity in general possible, whatever the intended type of existent may be and however it may be intended, even if we are dealing with perception of a real thing. Okay. Here, Derrida does not identify the noema with an ideal meaning or with the identity of an object. Rather, he states that the noema is their very condition of possibility. Footnote. Of course, one can easily cast a doubt on Derrida's system of equivalences. As it has been noted in a slightly different context, Derrida's reading of Husserl demands that we see his concepts of knowledge, ideality, sense, and expression as implying one another. Their mutual implication is a function of their having a common basis, i.e. the dependency on the concept of presence. A harsh critique of Derrida's notion of ideality and sense can be found in Dallas Willard as Derrida's view of ideal being really defensible in Derrida and phenomenology. The noema has to do with sense and not primarily with conceptual meaning. Here, a clarification on the notion of noematic sense is required. On the vexed question of its real status, Dominique Pradel has recently reacted to its assimilation to an ideal meaning. According to him, the advocates of Folisdal's line of interpretation are led astray by Husserl's use of the Frasian linguistic paradigm as early as the logical investigations. However, it is necessary to take into account the widening of the concept of meaning, Bedeutung, from the linguistic sphere to the whole noematic sphere that Husserl operates in Ideas 1. See Husserl, Ideas 1, 294. We shall restrict our regard exclusively to signifying, Bedeutung, and signification, Bedeutung. Originally, these words concerned only the linguistic sphere, that of expressing, but one can scarcely avoid and at the same time take an important cognitive step, Erkenntnisricht, extending the signification of these words and suitably modifying them so that they can find application of a certain kind to the whole noematic sphere. Thus, application to all acts, be they now combined with expressive acts, or not. Thus we have continued to speak of sense, sin. In the case of all intentive mental processes, That was 48. Okay, so however, it is necessary to take into account the widening of the concept of meaning from the linguistic sphere to the whole noetic structure that Husserl operates in Ideas 1. The extensional widening entails an intentional transformation, which means that the sense, sin, is detached from the logical/conceptual level in order to embrace the pre-expressive, perceptual elements prior to any conceptual shaping. Therefore, in general terms, the noematic sense is the mode of apparition or of exposition of the object, of the one object, be it through different modes of apprehension, perception, imagination, memory, etc. This is why the noematic sense is to be identified with the object considered in its how. Or, as Derrida puts it succinctly in his 1968 interview with Julia Kristeva, all experience is the experience of sense, sin. Everything that appears to consciousness, everything that is for consciousness in general, is sense. Sense is the phenomenality of the phenomenon. Section 5. The phenomenological fold. How is this conception of the noema supposed to cast a light on the question of phenomenality? At some point in Spectres of Marx, Derrida speaks about a phenomenological fold, i.e. that difference, both decisive and insubstantial at the same time, that separates being from appearing. By the expression phenomenological fold, Derrida means that phenomenology does not posit directly being as a being in itself externally opposed to consciousness. On the contrary, it investigates the subjectivity in the world, along with its regional ontologies, always from the perspective of the intentional correlation, which means that the world has sense only insofar as it is a world for a subject. Accordingly, in the Nachwort of the first book of Ideas, Husserl defines the world as a universal phenomenon, as the horizon of the pure manifestativity of being to a transcendental subjectivity that is, her alone, irrelative, i.e. receiving sense only from herself. Hence why some interpreters have felt entitled to stress the subject-world correlation by describing the transcendental subjectivity herself as the movement of appearing as such and as correlated to this appearing being and manifestation. The idea that in the transcendental realm we are not dealing with the world's simplicity, but rather with the world that is for consciousness, is already present in these general premises. There is a difference between the things as such and their appearing to consciousness, between things and phenomena, that is inherent and not exterior to being. Husserl thematizes this difference already in the sixth logical investigation, when he states that, while imagination could only presentify an image without an external intuition, perception has the capacity of presenting the perceived object. However, he adds, perception does not in general amount to a true being present, but only to an appearance of presence. Of course, the point here is not that perception creates delusions of presence. Presentation is only an intentional character of perception that does not constitute the thing as such, but only its particular way of appearing to the subject. This implies the fact that an intentional object is given in perception through different ways and qualitative variations, and the graduality of perception finds its vanishing point in the absolute sameness, i.e. in the complete and adequate fulfillment, Urfüllung, where the thing is perceived from every side and point of view. This is the reason why Husserl can write in the pages of Ideas 1 devoted to the phenomenology of reason, that with the noema we find, fused with the pure sense, the characteristic in person as originary fulfilledness. Of course, the complete fulfillment is only an ideal. It amounts to what Husserl calls the idea in the Kantian sense, namely the irreducible opening of the field of experience, or in his own words, a system which, in its eidetic type, is an absolutely determined system, grounded on the intentional unity of a process, of endless processes of continuous appearings. In Derrida's interpretation, this limitless opening of consciousness depends on the very anarchic status of the noema. And we have a long footnote here. However, there is one aspect of the noema and of phenomenology in general that Derrida fails to consider in his reading, which is the role played by the thing as transcendental clue that, as explained by Husserl, does not simply orient apprehension, but also prescribes rules governing the multiplicities of appearances. This lack could be explained by the fact that Derrida, as many other interpreters of Husserl, reads phenomenology as an idealism. Of course, in his memoir of 1954, he admits that this absolute idealism is a purely methodological one. Nonetheless, he maintains that although it is not a subjectivism in a classic type, it stays very inexplicit. In what sense it would be different. Furthermore, Derrida tries on several occasions to show how the problem of the passive genesis implies that it is possible for phenomenology to work without an ontology. The transcendental subject is always already an empirical subject, and it is because of this existentiality or factuality that the transcendental reduction cannot be fully accomplished and cannot be radically transcendental. The problem of this stance, however, is that it gives an ontological value to what is only a methodological division. Derrida himself seems to acknowledge this point at times. Where we see an absolute existential limit, Husserl sees only a methodological limit. Nevertheless, this highlighting of the factual is all but an acknowledgement of the realistic side of phenomenology, for it leads Derrida to charge Husserl of formalism, of proceeding by methodological abstractions. Now we have seen that the whole point of the notion of the noema consists for Husserl in overcoming the naturalistic opposition between internal and external reality. Even in the crisis of European sciences, where the intentional correlation between subject and object is fully thematized in a genetic way through the investigation of the operative, fungirende, relation between the transcendental subject and the world, Husserl locates the origin of the mathematization of experience operated by modern objectivism in the Galilean attitude that distributes the sensible plena exclusively on the side of the subject. The phenomena are only in the subjects. It is especially in the crisis that it becomes incontrovertibly clear how the essence of transcendental phenomenology lies in the effort of overcoming the radical disjunction of the subject from the world, and consequently, of being from its appearing. The paragraphs from 41 to 50 repeatedly stress that to thematize the life world and its transcendental value means above all to point out the correlation between appearance and that which appears as such, the synthesis through which the manifold appearances bear within themselves that which is as their object pool. Husserl mentions that which is and the object under quotation marks, and not long thereafter, in section 70, the exact status of the intentional object is again at issue. It is not by chance that he is forced to recall the statement in Ideas 1, according to which only the real tree can burn, while its noema cannot, and to precise one again that intentional objects are not integral parts of the intention, but something meant in it, its particular meaning, in this and modalities which only have meaning, sin, precisely for something like meaning. Already in section 55 of Ideas 1, we find a sharp critique of those philosophies that absolutize being by neglecting the role that consciousness plays in bringing to light its sense. It is a countersense, Widersin, to philosophize, and, while seeking the ultimate intelligence about the sense, sin, of the world, not to notice that the world itself has its own being as a certain sense, which presupposes absolute consciousness as the field where sense is bestowed, Feld der Singebung. And in an enlightening footnote, Husserl specifies, "Here, in passing, I am allowing myself an extraordinary and yet, in its way, admissible broadening of the concept of sense in order to state the contrast more effectively. The idea that sense, in this broadened conception, is made possible by the intentional correlation between the transcendental subject and the world. This is precisely what Derrida means with the notion of the phenomenological fold." Section 6. Difference and noema. In the previous sections, I have tried to explain the reasons behind Derrida's contentions, while at the same time trying to account for the general scope of Husserl's notion of noema. What I wish to do now is to provide a conclusive insight into how the interpretation of this particular phenomenological concept may have affected the early philosophy of the French philosopher. I began this paper by quoting, I don't know why I say quotating there, by quoting Lauler, who establishes a parallel between Derrida's différance and his anarchic interpretation of Husserl's noema. Here I suggest that, in order to understand what Lauler exactly means, we should take a step further and analyze the problems from the perspective of the question of phenomenality. Let us recall what Derrida says in the footnote from Spectres of Marx, namely that the non-reality of the noema is the condition of any experience and any phenomenality. Now, Derrida refers to the difference between the thing and its appearing for the first time in the grammatology. It is in the specific zone of this imprint and this trace, and the temporalization of a lived experience which is neither in the world nor in another world, which is not more in time than in space, that differences appear among the elements, or rather produce them. The unheard difference between the appearing and the appearances, and the appearance, l'apparition et l'appariteur, between the world and lived experience, is the condition of all other differences, of all other traces, and it is already a trace. What does it mean that the unheard difference between the appearing and the appearance is the condition of any other difference? And what does it mean that this primordial difference is already a trace? In order to address this issue, a detailed and genetic discussion of Derrida's main concepts and their various interpretations would be required. Here I will limit myself to a few remarks by considering only the quoted passage, which has been widely overlooked, even by many attentive readers of Derrida's philosophy and by phenomenologists. In fact, Derrida seemed to present difference as a sort of general or universal law of experience, or, in phenomenological terms, a kind of primordial synthesis between the world and lived experience, between that which appears and the way it appears. There would be no experience without this original difference, which, and Derrida states it quite clearly, is the condition of all other differences, for the sense of experience is neither in the subject nor in the world, but is located precisely in the continuous synthesis between the two of them. This is why Derrida can also say that the trace is the absolute origin of sense in general. But if the trace is the impossibility of a pure origin as such, this means that there is no absolute origin of sense in general. So the trace is the difference which opens appearance, l'appariteur, and signification. It is evident here how in Of Grammatology Derrida describes the trace and the difference in the very same manner he described the noema in his essay of 1959. If the noema is to be understood as what defies any simple and naive opposition in an exterior world given in itself, and if, according to Derrida, its anarchic status is the very condition of every sense and every experience in general, we can agree with Lauler and substantiate the thesis that the notion of the difference may be, at least partially, the outcome of a reworking of the Husserlian notion of noema. It is no accident that Derrida maintains that the Husserlian intentional correlation is indispensable to go beyond the naturalist juxtaposition between internal and external experience, the one that Husserl himself, as we have seen, and as Derrida recalls, struggled with from Ideas 1 to the Crisis. But what about intentionality? This concept, whose thematization justifies the introduction by Husserl of the couple noesis-noema, seems to disappear in Derrida's discussion of phenomenology. This is quite meaningful, as without intentionality there could be no phenomenology as a science. More precisely, the underlying question is the following. Is there any relation between intentionality and difference? If intentionality explains the relationship of the transcendental subject towards things and the world, is difference then the very condition of any possible intentional experience? Is it something more original than intentionality? These are problems that Derrida himself finds difficult to address or even to articulate. Here is what he says during his fierce debate with Searle. What is intentionality? What does intention properly mean as the particular or original work, mise en oeuvre, of iterability? I admit that this enigma grows increasingly obscure for me. It communicates with the greatest questions of being, of meaning, and of the phenomenon, of consciousness, of the relation to the object in general, of transcendence, and of appearing as such, etc. My frequenting of philosophies and phenomenologies of intentionality, beginning with that of Husserl, has only caused my uncertainty to increase, as well as my distrust of this word or of this figure, I hardly dare to say, concept. This last reference to the appearing as such is of great importance, but the extreme vagueness of Derrida's rumination makes it hard to discern a firm position on the subject. It would be necessary perhaps to enter more deeply into these theoretical problems. Be that as it may, here it shall suffice to point out the existence of this persistent meditation by Derrida on such a core issue of phenomenology as the question of phenomenality. In fact, in his introduction to the origin of geometry, he already gave value to the fact that only phenomenology could enlighten the conditions, the possibility, and the essence of being in manifestation, which in that particular context were historicity and the infinite dialecticalness of temporal experience. But in the more inventive works of 1967, the overcoming of phenomenology is fully accomplished. It is when Derrida completes his deconstruction of the phenomenological living present by stressing the unperceived, the non-present, and the non-conscious that lies at the heart of presence itself, or even that which cannot appear as such in the experience because it is the very condition of the appearing itself, that, he says, we pass the very limits of phenomenology. But if the difference can be posited as the non-apparent source of all appearing, as the former nocturnal source of the light, then everything that appears does it by differing from other phenomena, and, moreover, every phenomenon appears by differing in itself. The difference between the mundane thing that appears, l'apparition, and the phenomenological appearance, l'appariteur, i.e. the thing qua phenomenon, or the thing as being phenomenon in lived experience, is, in Derrida's view, already a trace, which means that there cannot be a clear and simple distinction between the transcendental field of reflection, the field of phenomena and lived experiences, and the naturalistic field of empirical experience. Of course, Derrida does not wish to preclude the possibility of such a methodological opposition. Yet, he believes that it cannot be pure. As Rodolphe Gasche brilliantly puts it, in order to present itself as such, the phenomenon must already have divided itself. Precisely this difference is what baffles appearing and limits to a secondary role the unheard of. Difference between appearing and appearance. Something analogous has been remarked by Rudolf Bernet. For Derrida, the presence of ideal objects and the self-presence of the transcendental subject are both the result of processes of representation. The intuition of presence of ideal objects as well as of the transcendental subject itself is conditioned by representation. That is to say, in Husserl's terminology, perception comes out of repetition, memory, and imagination. There is no pure perception or intuition, and, as a consequence, the opposition between presentation and representation, between perception on the one hand and repetition, memory, and imagination on the other, fades away. This is of course the nucleus and the very core of Derrida's voice and phenomenon, which notoriously implements a complex process of deconstruction of an entire system of conceptual oppositions between the represented and the representative in general, the signified and the signifier, simple presence and its reproduction, presence as Vorstellung and representation as Vergegen Ortigang. I'm messing up these German pronunciations, of course. In this sense, the contentious claim that perception does not exist means only that perception is not the origin of experience or the source of signification. Representation comes first, but, as Derrida would add, a representation that in this case does not reproduce anything. That is, in a certain sense, a radicalization of the phenomenological idea that everything that is given to consciousness can be retained, infinitely modified, and in that way form the basis of new impressions. See, for example, what Husserl himself says in section 107 of Ideas 1, titled Reiterated Modifications. Quote, in consequence of the constitution of something as existent affected anew at every step, an ideally infinite chain of reiterated modifications therefore results. Then the anarchic status of the noema, as Derrida describes it, is precisely what makes the formation of idealities through iteration possible. As we have seen, this is the lesson he learned from Husserl's so-called origin of geometry, and this is how we should explain his statement, inspired by his reading of Ideas 1, that the anarchy of the noema, as the condition of sense and of every possible experience, is also the condition of any objectivity. Therefore, it is now possible to understand by how much Deleuze's philosophy is Derrida's philosophy is indebted to the conceptual analyses developed by phenomenology, and how there cannot have been any deconstructive gesture without the preliminary analytic inquiry accomplished by Edmund Husserl.
More importantly, the concern for the transcendental conditions of phenomenality that I have accounted for, be it faithful or not to the phenomenological doctrine, may suggest an interpretation of Derrida's relation with phenomenology that does not reduce it, I'm sure it meant to say reduce it, to the traditional questions of sign, language, and temporality, but tackles the more general issue of transcendental experience. That is the end. Thank you guys for joining me today as I read a pretty much random JSTOR paper. This was called The Very Place of Apparition by Pietro Terzi out of the journal Research in Phenomenology from 2018. Thank you.